Recording in progress.
Okay, as you all heard, recording is in progress. We're getting serious now. Thank you all very much for being here in the room on the one hand and being live on our screens on the other hand. It's good to have you with us. It would be even better to have you here with us on spot, but still we're really grateful and thankful that you could make it and that you agreed to participate in our little workshop. So, and thank you very much for being patient. We ran a little bit over time with our lunch break, so I hope you will forgive us for the time delay. Now, this is the most difficult part of any workshop and conference, immediately after lunch break, but I'm really convinced that we're gonna deal with that in a very decent and motivating fashion, I suppose. Let me first of all introduce you our participants for this round. So, first of all, sitting here in front of me is Hannah Busch, who is a PhD candidate, still in the project Digital Forensics for Historical Documents at Huygens Institute in Amsterdam. Amsterdam, is it?
Yeah,
yes, Amsterdam. And Hannah studied German-Italian studies at Bonn and at Florence, and then received her MA in textual scholarship at the Freie Universität in Berlin. From 2013 to 18, she has been a researcher at the Trier Center for Digital Humanities at the University of Trier, and in 2018 she joined Huygens. She's also now, since this summer, a member of the Cologne Center for E-Humanities, where she works in the project Formierung Europas, and she's got a particular interest in deep machine learning. Our second speaker in this round is Alberto Campagnolo, who trained as a book conservator in Spoleto, and then practiced at several really famous and impressive institutions. The London Metropolitan Archive, St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt. I was very happy to learn about that, and of course, one might say, the Vatican Library. He studied the conservation of library materials at Ca' Foscari in Venice and received an MA in Digital Culture and Technology from King's College London. In 2015, he received his PhD on the subject Transforming Structured Descriptions to Visual Representations, an automated visualization of historical bookbinding structures. Our third speaker in this round is Lisa Fagin-Davis, who does not need any introduction, actually. Still, I will tell you a little about her. She's widely known as Executive Director of the Medieval Academy of America and an aficionado of the infamous Voynich manuscript. So that would be an entirely different subject for them. Lisa received her PhD in medieval studies from Yale University in 1993 with a thesis on Epiphany at Lambach, the evidence of the Gottschalk Antiphonary, which was published. The book was published in 2000, if I remember that correctly. And after that, she was very active in cataloging, of medieval manuscript collections at Boston, Yale, and other places. Me being a historian of late medieval France, obviously one of the most important works she published was La Chronique anonyme and universelle, Reading and Writing History in 15th Century France, which appeared in 2015. Lisa is on the forefront of digital manuscript studies for years now, and an eminent member of the community of fragmentologists. And last but not least, Tobias Hodel, who is an assistant professor in digital humanities at the University of Bern since 2019, and did his PhD at Zurich in 2016. The book has been published in 2020 under the title Schriftordnungen im Wandel, Produktionsgebrauchs- und Aufbewahrungspraktiken von klösterlichem Schriftgut in Königsfelden, which sounds quite serious actually, and is a quite serious study. He's a kind of combination of medievalist and DA specialist we're actually looking for also. He worked materially on the monastery of Königsfelden in a project of Simon Teuscher, if I remember correctly, and its social context. And later he was part of the project READ, Reconstruction and Enrichment of Archival Documents at the State Archives at Zurich between 2016 and 19. He's also one of the people behind Ad Fontes in Zurich and the editor of the series Digital Humanities Research, which is published by Transcript in Bielefeld. Just last year, if I have noted that correctly, he published a programmatic paper in the Historische Zeitschrift on consequences of handwritten text recognition and machine learning for the study of history, application classification, and methodological critiques. So we have a very eminent round of specialists here for this round of discussions. And in order to kick off our debate, I would like to ask all of you, perhaps in the series that I just stated, so starting with Hannah, in kind of 3 phrases to resume what you perceive to be the core message of the videos we all looked at with immense interest.
That's a tough one right after lunch. So I think, well, the point I try to make is that that we find ourselves in a computational turn between computational methods to more automated methods, and also especially in the last months, I think nobody has missed it with ChatGPT and so on. Basically, AI tools became available for everyone, and you could achieve things that you thought you couldn't achieve. But I've been researching in how to apply deep machine learning to paleography, medieval Latin paleography. And I think it might be like the box of Pandora if we start to just apply the tools that are available for everyone to our historic research material. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Just in order to be sure, can you understand us on the... yeah, okay. So then let's continue with Alberto.
So, hello everyone. Sorry I couldn't make it, but COVID caught me. So I guess the main point that I was trying to make in my video is that there are still a lot of things that we still need to digitize. So as you pointed out earlier, I'm born as a book conservator, so I work with the object in its materiality and physicality. And actually, what I normally put it is like I look at everything but the text. And if we want to really study these objects remotely, there's still a lot of information that we could capture digitally, but we are not yet at that stage. So that is why I think feel like digital codicology is very much behind what has been possible to do for paleography, because we can't digitize the object in the details that are needed just by taking pictures. You can do something, but there is a lot more that needs to be done in different ways, and we need different data points for these different aspects that we want to study. So there is a lot that still needs to be done and put together into this into a digital object that can represent more of the physicality of the object.
Thank you very much, Alberto. Moving on to Lisa.
Yes, hi, good morning, everyone. The first thing I want to say is I hope everyone is okay. The world is on fire, and it's really lovely to all of us gather today. And I hope everyone is all right, and that if you have family or friends in the middle of this nightmare, that they're okay too. But it's lovely to be with you today, and thank you for inviting me. On the question, I would say that I think the more of these tools that are developed and the more digital methodologies that come to the fore, I think it's always important to make a distinction between AI as a tool and AI as doing the work for us, because it can't, right? All it can do is help us to do our work. And we can't expect AI to look at, for example, Hannah was showing a lovely manuscript, 12th century Engelberg. When I look at that manuscript, I see the aspect tells me it's 12th century Switzerland, and then I know which particular letter forms I'm going to need to look at. And that's the nuance, I think, where the real challenge is. is that human discernment. And it's important to remember that these are tools, they're not going to replace us, but they're going to help us do our work more efficiently and effectively.
Thank you very much. And moving on to Tobias.
Yeah, also thanks a lot from my side for having me. And first of all, very sorry for the mic in the video. I don't know what happened. So if you had to endure that, I owe you something. That's my bad. What I tried to come up in my talk is really the idea that we need to start thinking about how we conceptualize our field. When we train the system, so if we do text recognition, or if we do named entity recognition, or if we do language modeling or event extraction or whatever, and it's really similar to what Hannah already said, we use concepts and we need to think as a community. And I think here we as digital medievalists are really at the core of this. We need to think of how to frame that. So, for example, what do we make of a character? And I know Lisa can talk a lot about glyphs and parts of glyphs, but we should really focus on that and say, okay, what does this mean if we think a machine should be able to recognize such a glyph? Because that makes the glyph puts the glyph basically into existence. The same goes for names. What is a name basically? What do we tag as a name? And the machine will never be able to tell, I chose this to be as a name because of the reasoning, so and so. So the reasoning has to come from our side, and we need to make sure that in this discussion, that's basically there is a humanist perspective, that it's at the front of the whole thing. So it's really epistemological questions that only can be answered by scholars that are trained with the material, that have an idea of how we can recreate or if conceptualize this times. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, all four of you. I meant to start out with a different question for our next round of questions, but since you all pointed out this specific tension between using digital methods and digitally based methods with a kind of skeptical eye or careful approach, because there's a tension between using it as a tool, as you said, Lisa, and seeing the possibilities that arise. Let me just ask you, what would you say, apart from the perhaps dangers and shortcomings that we are incurring, what would you say are new avenues based on the application of these technologies in your specific fields for actually generating new insights or new questions even we might ask? So let's flip the coin and ask for a moment for the potential, apart from the sheer speed and capacity to treat huge amounts of data.
I'll jump in there. I have several projects that I started 20 or 30 years ago that I put down because I didn't have the technical capacity to do them. They couldn't be done. And things like working with a huge amount of script samples and trying to quantify them so that I could sift through them and figure out which ones might be by the same hand. That's something that the work that Hannah is doing is going to get us to a place where we can do that, where we can automate some of that, which is really exciting because it gives us this opportunity. We're not all Bernard Bischoff. We can't all carry around 2,000 scribes in our head and remember where we saw them, even though we wish we could. And so that, I think, is where the Bischoff robot is going to really be helpful. And VisCall, that's another example where suddenly we have this opportunity to see things in a different way that we couldn't before, and being able to encode that into a manuscript description, such as the work that Todd has done. And Alberto, it's really, I think it's extremely exciting.
Any other perspective?
If I may pick up on that, I think, I think what we need to be starting to think about is how to deal with these masses, because this requires a complete new methodology. So we're used to work on single charters or single books, but what happens if we now want to try to come up to terms with the thousands of books? And I think this is the opportunity that Lisa's talking about, but also at the same time, I think at the moment we're not built to do that. So our databases are not built to do that. Our digitization departments are not built to do that, although they start to move up in scale. But at the moment, we're still in this stage that, okay, in the way we're thinking about the scholar of the 20th century that traveled around and looked at single books, but at the same time, we want to have access at the whole information at the same time. So in a sense, this is an exciting avenue, but I'm not sure if we're there already methodologically. So how can we deal with these different layers of this text? So I mean, you're familiar with the term of distant reading, but what does this mean? So just to see which terms occur the most frequent. Of course, this tells me something about the semantical shifts that are ongoing, but we need basically a refinement of our methodology. I mean, Silke, who is in the Zoom room, she did tremendous work in her PhD about that, but these are still single instances where people already have access to a large corpus. So I think it's this, on the one hand, we need more digitization, and on the other hand, we need to even more think about how can we research within these masses. I think biology, for example, they're doing a tremendous job with that, with handling these masses of data, and we're only at the beginning of that. So not just a positive, but basically two-way approach.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. And I mean, we had exactly the same problems when you go to study the structure and binding. So we have a Nicolas Pickwood who can tell you that book was sold in Italy and then brought to Germany and rebound for a purpose of one specific person, because he has it all in mind, but we don't have a lot of data behind it. Because he has collected it, but he's published a lot, but we don't have the full understanding of the whole European, even just the European bindings history. And this is where collecting data about the structure in a more systematic way, and that's available to more people the same way that the images of manuscript now are available to the masses, is where you can start really digging into the history and understanding where things started to be made and what kind of structure they were used, materials they were used, and really understand the evolution of the materials. Also in the same way as Tobias was saying about the biology. So there is a lot of data that we can gather about the biology of the human beings, and we know there are missing links. The same way of looking into the evolution of biology can be applied to binding structure and see where do we have the missing links. All of a sudden, we have the sewing supports that appear in all the European books, which wasn't present in the Middle East. And we know that's the missing link there. How do we really got to that point? And the sewing direction, there are so many things that big data can help us to understand, but we need the data there to start with.
Yeah, maybe to add there, especially to what Tobias said, that of course we have the computational power, and we have all the data, and we can do a lot of things, but it also makes us reflecting on the data that has been produced. So not only the history of the objects, but also the history of the data we are working with. So we don't have the capacities to redo all the metadata, all the cataloging, all the descriptions, and we have them in databases that are not always suitable to be worked with automated methods, but I mean, we know that computers can do a lot of things. They can process tons of images at the same time. But now it makes us look at the data and to see how do we need to shape our data, how can we reuse the data, and of course also considering that the computer looks at single features more or less, or it doesn't look at a manuscript like we look at a manuscript. Like Lisa said, we see a page and then we see it's 12th century. But it can also help us to visualize and then find outliers, for example, because we might just look at one part of at the script, for example, because we tell them of the color of the background, and then we can find outliers and we can look into directions that we wouldn't have looked at before, because we didn't see it in all the masses of manuscript that we have to leaf through if we just use the viewer. So I think there are opportunities beyond the power that comes to our mind when we think of AI and deep machine learning and image analysis in general. But yeah.
What I actually find very intriguing in the example you just mentioned is that by the way of huge collections and the automated analysis of huge amounts of data, it actually leads us back to the individual historical artifact in a certain way, as you put it right now, because then it helps us dating the individual singular page, a fragment that's been transmitted or whatever. So that's kind of an interesting turn for me, because my original first question I wanted to ask you, and perhaps that's the right moment to put it on the table. In our application for our research project, we were talking about virtual objects. And I was wondering if in your specific fields and approaches, you kind of developed an idea of it, or a definition of what virtual object could actually mean, because it became very clearly in the presentation by Lisa, actually, by putting together the fragments of a dissolved manuscript. This exists in a purely virtual environment, or in a purely virtual way. And the same could be said for the reconstitution of dispersed libraries or things like that, who only exist as entities in this kind of forms. Would that also hold true for the other fields where you kind of assemble these huge amounts of data, or how would you perceive that?
I think that's so important. You know, the work that I'm doing, we're talking about building something in a virtual space that does not exist in the real world and cannot exist in the real world. We will never physically put these books back together. It cannot be done. It's unimaginable. And so in a virtual space, we can start to do that work and create an object that I've stopped calling them reconstructions, because they really aren't. They're resequences. We're not actually building the three-dimensional codex. We are putting images of that codex in order in a virtual space, taking advantage of IIIF and linked open data and all of those things. And so what you end up with is, in fact, something that is only a virtual object. It's not a digitized manuscript. It is a simulacrum of something that cannot exist. And I think a lot of us are doing that kind of work. That's a lot of what we're trying to accomplish, is put things in, by putting something in a virtual space, it becomes accessible. I don't have to travel all over the world. I'd like to, but I don't have to see all of these leaves in person, as much as I wish I could. And that opens a whole new door of accessibility for scholars all over the world. And that's also, I think, a really important part of what we're trying to do here is increase access in all sorts of exciting ways.
I also saw Alberto nodding when I asked my question, so I assume.
Yeah, I mean, what I normally refer to is this. It's the digital culture object. So it's this layering of information about the all the different features of the materiality of the object. The collation, for example, so how the gathering structure is put together, but then you can add on all the bindings, the structure and materials used, and each one, as I was aiming at in my presentation, each one of these aspects requires a specific way to bring that into the digital. But when we make all of these data sets talking together, we can create a digital object that can help us to study the physical object that we have, or the physical objects, we want to talk into a plural as well, in a way that it's kind of, it goes beyond what we can actually do with the actual object. So it's not a substitution per se, but it's a way, it's a tool, it becomes a tool to study the original objects in a way that we can really manipulate them and dig into them. And they're also much simpler. I don't know if we want complexity, but actually they are much simpler than the original object because we selected just what we wanted to study. And that makes it easier to study in a way, and we can actually understand it better. And sometimes we end up with questions that we can't answer with that digital object, and then we go back into the original and we add layers of information to the digital object. So I see it as a recursive transformative process that goes from the original to the digital, and we use the tool of the digital to study the object and then go back and ask further questions. This is how I see it. But the problem is that we are not, for what concerns the physicality, we are very at the baby steps still. So that's, I put a lot of work into the collation with this code, but we have to add a lot more data to really get to this idea of the digital cultural object in a working way.
Yeah, I like to call it the digital facsimile. So it's kind of a representation, but it tries to show all the features. But of course, the digitized object that we work with, especially when we apply computational methods, we also have to think more abstract how a computer sees an image. It doesn't see the colors, it sees numbers and edges. And also, one thing that I think is very important, that the digitized object always comes with the metadata that might be more accessed, especially when scholars work with digitized objects, usually access them via their metadata. I mean, it's the same when you do it with a library catalog, but depending if the object is accessible as also images, so there's of course is a set of metadata already a digitized virtual object or not? Or does it always has to come together with the images? But yeah, I always also like to emphasize in general that I'm working with digitized objects, with digitized manuscripts, because the research that I'm doing is based on the availability of digitized objects, and I also think that they are as important as the originals when it comes to that field of study. So, but to make because of course I couldn't do the same research if I just had analog originals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'd like to add to Anna is that I consider modeling and metadata tagging as a step of digitization. So it's not just the images, that is already a step of simplification and make it the data in such a way that you can use it with a computer.
One of the big problems we have in the United States, among many, but in particular with where our early European material is concerned, is that we have at least 500 collections in North America that have this kind of material, whether codices or fragments or single leaves or cuttings or documents. And very few of those institutions have staff on site who can catalog this material in a way that would be thorough and make it nicely discoverable. And so over here, what we're trying to get collections to do is to just digitize the material, put the images online with the absolutely minimal metadata, and then we can go back in and flesh it out, but at least get it out there with a shelf mark, maybe an approximate date and place, a title, if you can think of it, if you can figure out what it is, and just get it out there. And that's a very different kind of philosophy of manuscript data, right? Sometimes there's this feeling that you can't put anything online until you have all of the information and a completely full record. If we did that, we'd never get anything done, right? So you have to find a compromise of what's the minimal metadata that will make this object discoverable once it's online. And this is, of course, where linked open data and authorities, are really, really important. And so that's kind of the fight we're fighting over here. And we have a different set of problems, I think, than manuscripts that are still in situ.
I had the impression that Tobias wanted to jump in also, but okay.
I'm happy jumping in, but it was more back to the concept of virtualization. So I never thought so. When I was invited to this event, I said, "Yeah, I'm happy to do something, but be aware, I don't do anything virtual in that sense." But thanks to the question, I started thinking about it. And in a way, if we're dealing with language models, this is some kind of a virtualization of an ancient or of a language form that's not even existing anymore. So in that sense, it is some sort of a resequencing. I really like the term. That's great, Lisa. So from that point of view, I think virtualization can mean a lot. The question is a bit, when do we stretch the term too far and it's not productive anymore? But maybe we should think more about virtualizations in general. So if we're working on also abstract terms, when is this a form of virtualization? And I think also going back to Silke's talk this morning, where she was showing VR without the idea of a reconstruction, but rather a form of navigating in space. And I mean, theoretically, we could do that with language models, for example, like ChatGPT as well. Although I mean, it's not possible with ChatGPT because it's a closed system, but we could try to do that with open source system, where we basically could now navigate the way the language is structured. That would also be some sort of virtualization. This event made me aware of, so thanks already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for that. I'm just looking at inside our room here and at our chat manager because I can easily imagine that there are already questions from the larger public, and we actually have some from the chat.
Yes, one question came up from Anton K. He wrote, "Thank you for your presentations. I have a question to Tobias Hodel. I wonder if you have some insight of the event concept on overlap of term and network analysis and historical one. For example, when we cluster some items like character, date, place, can we point it in an event, or we need some filter to approach to historical term?"
Did you get that acoustically, Tobias? Okay.
Yeah, I think I can answer to that. I mean, it's quite a specific question, and I'm not sure if I have the sufficient answer to that. The TEI, the Text Encoding Initiative, just in its latest version, I think they just added event as a term basically to their system. It was not existing before, which was interesting. And I was hoping that the TI would come up with a nice description or definition of what an event is, because I'm struggling a bit with that. Because I mean, in a sense, an event could be something like a photograph taken, and you can take like millions of photographs within seconds if you have the right machinery. So then you would have 1 million events in 1 second, theoretically. But unfortunately, the TI, the consortium didn't come up with a definition. So we're still on our own. And this means also that I think we have to go back a bit to a project-based approach that is led by the questions that we're asking us scholarly. So the event in that case basically means what for your project an event should supposed to be. The way we are using it within our project is quite tightly tied to transactions. So if someone sells, for example, a house or something else, that would be called an event. So that's but that's not a nice definition I'm coming up with. So the answer is is a bit closer. Yeah. Thanks for pasting the SciDoc. I think SciDoc is much more closer, but still, I mean, the event can also be a lot of things. But maybe you want to add on that, Alberto.
I was just pointing to that because I mean the whole CDOC modeling is based on event, so everything is an event, and of course, being a cultural heritage base, it's everything that changes the status of the object, whether it's something happens to it or it's passed on to a different collection, a different person. So everything that's changed the status is an event for the CDOC. That's how they define it.
Thank you very much for that. And then I have a question by Suzette.
Hello. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that unintentionally this has become a very digital medievalist panel. I did not think of that, but now I see all of these people together and now I realize, yes, these are all colleagues. I am interested in what you all are saying about this idea of mass digitization. Lisa, you just said, like, if we want to digitize things, we just put some basic information because we don't really have the capacity to get a super detailed description and everything for every manuscript online, which I understand, but I feel like there's a bit of a contradiction. I'm not sure what the contradiction is, might be a strong word, with Alberto's ideas he presented in his videos, where he discusses how you can, in different ways, kind of show different aspects of the medieval manuscript in digitization, because in that case that would be depending on which techniques or how many techniques you want to use to present one manuscript can be super big. So it's kind of like a question of this mass digitization and like bigger data we want to study versus very detailed specific digitization. I'm also reminded of this article by Andrew Prescott and Lorna Hughes, the case for slow digitization, which I feel like is a recent article, but it's not. It was written in 2018. Time is a lie. But yeah, so I'm wondering this: how can we reflect, or can you reflect maybe on this idea of we want to have big data, but we also want to have specific, detailed medieval manuscript digitizations?
I have thoughts on this, obviously. So, on the one hand, I agree with Lisa. Also, especially because of the point that there should be some metadata, like, shelf mark, dating, title, what is there, but it also the way how it's encoded and how it's presented. For example, one of my favorite examples is when people start using IIIF and then they don't fill out the form for the presentation API, so the metadata that travels with the image is not existent, or that they don't use the see also link where you can link to existing descriptions. But I also want to point out the difference between a machine-readable manuscript description, so when we look at eCodices Switzerland, everything is in TI. Other collections publish PDFs and they have a digital catalog, which is not machine-readable. So for me, as someone who wants to analyze metadata and use it for machine learning, I need the structured metadata. And then less is better than a lot, but not accessible for my purpose. And also, I'm referring here to what Holly Wright said at the workshop in Tours that Alberto organized, the type and hope. So I think at some point when we manage to get some tools that can help us doing image-based search, it can assist the keyword search, and then we might overcome also some of the shortcomings of the search interfaces. But I think, the way how we put the little data we have online is important, and maybe not, and the quality of the data and not the amount. So yes to mass digitization, and we also know that we can't redo all the digitization that has been done. So we have to deal with what is there, and I think we shouldn't hold back images.
And I would put in a plug here for the newly launched Digital Scriptorium 2.0. I don't know if you've checked it out, but the whole point of the new Digital Scriptoriums, working with the University of Pennsylvania, developed a way to automate structured metadata. So in other words, Digital Scriptorium will ingest whatever records you have, whether they're MARC or TEI or through IIIF and a JSON, and automates the process of adding structured metadata to allow all of this multi-platform searching. It just launched a few weeks ago, and you should definitely go and take a look. It's a result of years of work, and it's a really exciting opportunity for collections in North America to make their manuscripts discoverable through this structured metadata. It's really fantastic. I'm going to put a link in the chat.
And getting back to Suzette's question, I don't think that actually the two ways of looking at it are in contradiction one to the other, because I see like the slow digitization as it's a slow process that accrues over time. But also, as I pointed out earlier, I consider metadata and modeling as a first step into digitization. So if we don't start with even the minimal amount of information, then we can't really go into the further additional data that, of course, I want it all, but it's the important thing is that the whole different aspect can be added at a point later in time, and what is challenging here is to make all these data sets available and they communicate to each other. So structure metadata on the other end, but also how do we make all of these data sets talk to each other and relate to each other? So that is the big question of the slow digitization that I think is still unsolved properly. But even just having some information about the object, it will be really important. I was in Wolfenbüttel a couple of weeks ago in Germany looking for Carolingian bindings, and according to the catalog, there were loads. And actually, only thanks to the help of the conservators who were really helpful and expedited the whole process, I was able to find the one remnant Carolingian structure that there is in Wolfenbüttel. The rest wasn't there, or it was mislabeled as a Romanesque binding, actually. So if I have to, if I only had access to a limited amount of data set and data points on the object, even without the overarching problem of the typologies, I think it's best to say what you see than what you think you're seeing. So if I were given the data set about where there are wooden bolts and there is a V-shape lacing, suppose, that will give me more information than this is a Carolingian binding or a Romanesque binding. So just a basic level of information, it's a good entry point to then add and get information and see the books if we have to, and build on that. So I don't see them as contradiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for that. I was just struck by the kind of very technical turn our discussion took at the moment, and being kind of a mainstream traditional medievalist myself, I was wondering where you would try and demonstrate to other colleagues or people like me, let's put it that way, who are much more pedestrian in technological and digital things. Where would you pinpoint, or where would you see a direction where you could bridge the existing gap between those two communities of very technical and digital orientated colleagues, and on the other hand, people working in the more mainstream. Let's for the sake of simplicity, let's call it mainstream approach of what has been done in medieval studies in the 20th century.
I think that's what's so great about what's happening right now. We've finally gotten to a point where you can do digital work without having to learn coding. You don't have to know how to encode in TEI to take advantage of TEI. You don't have to know how to parse a JSON to take advantage of IIIF. And that's a huge, really important transition. So 20 years ago, when Digital Medievalist got started, everyone who was involved in Digital Medievalist was a hardcore coder. These were people doing like really intense, serious coding work. And now we've transitioned to a point where many of the people involved in Digital Medievalist consider themselves to be doing digital work, but are not coders. And that's a huge transition. And I think it speaks to the fact that we have developed tools that can be used by the non-specialist. It's not scary. It doesn't have to be intimidating. Once you kind of just sit down and see how it works, if you can use a mouse, you can import, you can mirror a IIIF image,
Mm-hmm.
Which is not to say that it's not a good thing to know how to parse a JSON, right? It's helpful if you understand how TEI works, but you don't have to understand it in order to make use of it.
Yeah, we saw with Dot a big increase in people. So we've developed together the VSCORE project, which is a way to model and visualize the gathering structure of books in codex format. But up to 3 years ago, it was all XML, and you had to know how to use the XML in a way. And now you can do about 90% of what VSCORE can do with a visual interface, and we've seen a big increase in people using it. And especially from my other community, book conservators, who would never want to do anything with XML, but they are using it a lot, and they are putting the data there. So it's this tool building. It's really, really important for to make it so that other people can input digital data, and then we can, we have more data that we can use.
I would like to stress that, first of all, coding got much more easier, not only thanks to ChatGPT. The system is pretty good in doing some Python, just saying, and it codes much nicer than I ever could. So basically, you also have infrastructure that are available. I mean, even if you don't want to use Google all the time, but the Colab infrastructure is really helpful for simple coding. So basically, in the classroom, it's not so hard to basically disseminate some code, and people then can run it on the cloud without having some specialized computer or anything. So that's the first one. The second one is, I think that we're also seeing on scale the effects of digitization and seeing first glimpses of what still is being developed. And I think the whole named entity recognition is there a nice first step, because if we know what places, persons, organizations get mentioned in certain manuscripts or documents, it's pretty easy to create some first visualization out of that. You can do that in Palladio, which is also a small platform that's hosted at Stanford, for example, where you just can plug in a CSV file that you got from such a recognition process, and then within some seconds you have a first graph that shows you what is connected to what. And of course, then the whole question starts. What does it mean? Two people appearing in the same document? Could be anything. And but this is basically the productive stages that we should enter now, so that we say, okay, now let's do that for these 200 documents and see if we have some clusters that get identified. So it's basically this switching of the layers that I already mentioned, having a look at documents on a larger scale, and then zooming in and focusing on only a couple of documents, and then maybe only on one or two of the documents that are most central, for example. But at the same time, then starting to think, what does this mean for this time I'm researching? What does this mean for this specific monastery or this institution I'm interested in? So what can I make from that connection? And then it becomes also quite historical or literary. So that then the scholarly work basically comes back, that we need to make sense out of it. And that's really hermeneutic work. So the digital does not replace basically the building of thesis or hypothesis at the end, but rather it's a middle step that we have in between, and that becomes part of our methodological apparatus that we're working with.
Yeah, also, I think one of the most joyful, but sometimes also most exhausting things is when you're a digital medievalist is the communication and collaboration with the experts, because you need each other, but you need also to understand each other. So you're often also translating what comes from the computer science side. Luckily, there's a lot of pop culture references, like I can take the example from Sander with the memes, that you can find a way to discuss topics via those things, and also when you consider to how to create data, that you can find ways to look at manuscripts and find ways to record data that you need for your training processes. For example, we had the matching manuscripts, so we were always, at some point we were thinking, okay, we could build something like a swiping app, because we need only images with, for example, a specific script type, and you can just give an expert the app and say swipe to the left, swipe to the right, and so the other person gets an idea how to find the data, how to collect it, and how the process works. And I think including everyone in the process also of finding ideas, and it's also always a way of testing your own technical approaches, how useful they are for the experts, and at the same time, I mean, I couldn't do the work I'm doing without the experienced experts, because we're just trained in a very different way. Like digital humanists are usually trained in a very interdisciplinary way, and we can't have the deep knowledge of our fields.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. This sounds very optimistic, actually, and very positive. And it's in a slight contrast to some of your videos you put at disposition, because in them you kind of tended to rather underline the shortcomings or difficulties. And I will get back to that in a minute, but before that there's a question by Gerd Lubich.
Yeah, just following up a question of self-perception. We see you as a community of specialists, but do you see yourselves in regard to the traditional historical research as auxiliary scientists? I don't mean that I hold a chair for auxiliary sciences. I think that's groovy, but I just want to see how you see yourselves.
As digital medievalists.
Sorry?
As digital medievalists.
Yeah, but in relation.
I'm a paleographer. I'm a codecologist, but I take advantage of the digital tools that are available to me to do my work.
I'm an hybrid of so many things, so I don't know how I see myself, but it's like I take in all the training I did for years as a book conservator, and I try to bring that into the digital so that other people can use that. So maybe it's an auxiliary scientist in a way. I don't know. It's a hybrid of many things.
From the perspective of history, I see myself as an auxiliary scientist, and I don't say that with any shame. But ever since I moved to Bern and was considered age person, I basically understand this as auxiliary means for the other disciplines. But at the same time, of course, I would make strong arguments that the DH is a field in itself, and that it has its own questions. And so in a way, it's a bit. Maybe it's comparable to what numismatics or other fields are doing. They have their own questions, but for other disciplines, they can be of auxiliary support in that sense.
Yeah, I started with intercultural studies, and I think now when I see myself in the field of digital humanities and the position I'm in between computer scientists and experts in humanities and in history. I think that, intercultural studies, the skills I learned still work very well because it's a lot of building bridges and understanding different fields. So,
medievalists are always interdisciplinary, right? I mean, by definition, that's who we are. There is no such thing as medieval studies that isn't interdisciplinary. And, I'm also a professor of library science. So with that hat on, I think a lot about data modeling because that's what librarians do, right? Our whole job is to make things discoverable, is to make the objects in our collections findable by scholars. That's the work. And that translates, I think, for me into everything I do. Everything I do is about facilitating not only my own work, but those of other scholars.
So we
totally
subscribe to. Sorry to interrupt you, Alberto.
I was just saying that I totally subscribe to what Lisa was saying.
So we reached a kind of consensual multi-perspectivity here, which is a good thing. And on the one hand, I just asked our chat manager if there are any further questions, because I wouldn't want to overlook any question from our online participants.
No, there aren't any more questions.
No questions in our chat, but I obviously do have questions, because I would like to turn again to, well, what I would like to consider or call the dark side of the digital and medieval world. And you mentioned or you raised a number of specific questions. I think it was in your video, Tobias, where you pointed out the importance of the black box of where the computing happened, especially if we work with artificial intelligence, neural networks that we do not exactly understand how they work, which models they are based on, which material they have been fed on, and how they calculated with which algorithms they use. Where do you see the specific shortcomings or dangers or difficulties in that respect when looking at your own project?
So I mean, the elephant in the room there is basically this really huge and large approaches that are taken by OpenAI or Meta, that they may sometimes release their models and they work quite nice. So if you have some early Latin text and you feed it into ChatGPT, the thing will be able to extract some information. And of course, thus we can conclude that the system does have seen some Latin in the training process. But of course, this doesn't tell us anything about the bias that is implemented with regards to that. And I think this is the most problematic part of that we have to deal with these biases. And I think, so the example I usually do there is with text recognition. The system is only capable of recognizing the characters that it has been taught. So basically, by transcribing in the sense of this ground truth, which is a highly problematic concept if we're thinking post-structurally. So what is a ground truth? I think Foucault turns every time in his grave when he hears that. So every time we transcribe something and we then train a model, we basically define the world and be it only on the existing characters for this specific model. But basically, this training material defines the world for this machine learning algorithm. And it's the same if you're doing that with a language model. And with all the large ones, we just don't have an idea what this world does consist of. And this is why for our project, usually we do start with our own models. So we basically put together something that we think could be a representative corpus and train the system. Of course, the whole training process is also black box-ish because it's a maximization algorithm. So the system just wants to improve based on a given set that is for training and a given set that is for validation and for testing. And the system just optimizes towards this testing that it wants to do at the end. So what really happens inside the model then has to be basically, or then we have to try to find out, but only on a later stage once we do have a model. But I think we just first of all, what we need is an awareness. So we need to have the awareness about the shortcomings. And then I think we can start playing also with the shortcomings and with the advantages that we do have. But I think it's some sort of algorithmic literacy that is needed so that people understand, okay, we use a language model, for example, that then is used for a tagger where we then recognize entities. But this is based on this corpus of text, if this is available, and also on this definition of what, in the case of the named entities, is a person or a place or an organization or a whatever entity. So the definition of the entity somehow has to be clear and clearly stated. And I think then we're allowed to use it. And of course, we have to reflect on it if we want to publish about it. Also, if we're only historians.
Then this is a really important point, too, because you're talking in part about the importance of modeling your data. Like, how many of us have started a project and then only realized 3 months into it that we did it all wrong and we have to go back to the beginning and start over, right? We've all been there. And so that's a really important part of the human element of this, is thinking about how to structure your metadata, not just to structure it, but to think really carefully and try and anticipate how your users are going to want to access that information. And that can be really challenging. I know how I want to access that, but can I predict all of the possible ways that all of the possible users are going to want to approach this data? I can't, right? All we can do is try and model data that works for as many people as possible. But that's a real challenge. I think that's a real challenge that we all face in thinking about these projects.
Mm-hmm.
I have questions in there.
We got a question in the room. Sunny, please.
Sorry, I wanted to follow up on the AI literacy, because I wanted to broaden the scope a little bit. Of course, we need AI literacy. We need to know what these large language models can do and can't do. And I think that we are thinking about this as a community. I feel that there's constantly discussion about this. But there's also the world outside university. And that was addressed in the earlier session. So, for example, for art history, an example is where AIs are being used to create new Picassos using the Pentimenti. So they train an AI to draw like Picasso, they have the IRR of the Pentimenti, and there you have it, a new Picasso, and we'll sell it for millions of euros. Do you feel that we have a responsibility as scientists to address these? So it's our methodologies, so to say, that are being misused or not? How do we relate to these kind of usages of these new technologies?
I think absolutely. We have responsibility also in how we approach it in our own projects and how we communicate it to students, to colleagues, to get more of this AI literacy and to explain how it works. And often when I discuss what I'm doing, of course, right now a lot of people come and say, but this is possible and look what you can do with Google. And then you explain, also already when you think about the captchas that Google uses, and it's like, that's training material. So I think explaining how things work help to understand, and also that the image rights, of course, that if you most tools use everything they can access, and that they disregard image rights, and there's huge bias created, and we need to teach a lot of consciousness when using AI tools. And I think especially in research projects where we have the time to experiment with deep machine learning and AI, we also reflect on it, and it's also important that we reflect on our methods and we talk about it. So also, in the end, maybe the broader public can, and especially also the people that we teach and the students can get those insights. So I think it's a very important topic, and that's something that goes very fast right now. That's my feeling. This goes very fast, and we don't have the time to explain, also because all the data that is created now, in my opinion, will be reused to train new models. And I think what is created now is not all good, especially text and stuff. We all have seen text created by ChatGPT. And when you think, okay, this is the training data of the future, I think it's really like, the box of the Pandora that we...
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think we should also think a lot about terminology. And for me, this artificial intelligence term is one of these false friends, because there is no clear-cut definition for what artificial intelligence really means. I would consider it a field of research, which is really broadly, but it does not denominate anything that you can point towards and say, okay, this is what is being understood. So this is why I prefer the term machine learning. Machine learning as a term has also a lot of problems because it has this learning implication with it, but at least it somehow simulates or points towards one kind of technology. And of course, we as scholars, we should try to make aware of the shortcomings, but at the same time, we should also try to avoid this over problematization and saying, "Oh, it's going to destroy the world." I think this only plays into the pockets of people that are effectively selling the technology. I think what we should be aware is of the whole social inequalities that are coming with that. So we have currently discussions about leveraging large language models, of course, because everyone wants to do that. But within the whole of Switzerland, and I mean, Switzerland is not huge, but there is no computing center that would be enough to mirror only the half of what the ChatGPT or the GPT 4.0 model would require for training. So in a whole country, you don't find the capabilities to replicate that. So we basically would have to go to Hugging Face in France to do it. And also there, it's not sure if they could do it on the scale that is necessary. So there are basically 5 or 6 companies in the world that can mirror that. And I think this is a huge problem. I know that it leads us quite far away from the medieval studies field, but at the same time, this would be an interesting technology, or this is an interesting technology that we can use for medieval studies, because this gives us like different perspective on the whole field. And of course, it would be great to have a system where all of the available texts are there, and we can basically interact with this textual representation. Yes, it is our duty, but at the same time, I think if we show what we're doing in our research, people will realize that this AI thing is not something that they know from movies. And I think this is where a lot of the perception is coming from.
It's not Skynet, right?
Not yet, Lisa, not yet. We'll get another question first by Christina and then by Suzette.
When I looked at your videos, I don't know which one it was, but one of them showed very literally a little bug lying on the page.
That was mine.
And that connects me to a question which perhaps has a social implication as well, because we have a very small, really tiny TBI project, but since we have a very short manuscript, we'll be through the manuscript we have our ground truth, basically. So there's no need for learning engines. But I'm wondering if you work with learning engines and have a vast amount of data, how many proofreading passes do you need to make sure that every bug is found? And who does it? And that's the social implication of my question, because I'm wondering, can the machines correct themselves, or do you need some trick to prevent your co-workers from getting very sad because they do little else, but correcting the engine?
So let me just ask, did you get that online? Did you hear it, or should we repeat it?
Could you repeat it?
Yeah, the question mainly boils down, or mostly boils down to the question on the implication of humans in the correction part of the training process. So how many loops of correction of machine-created results are needed in order to train the model? And how do you deal with this kind of human factor? Because there's a huge level of potential frustration involved in that. And Hannah wanted to start out.
It's a rabbit hole. So bugs keep appearing and appearing, especially when you develop something, because we're not the private sector industries, so there's not a lot of money and manpower, woman power involved in developing. Also, it's an experiment, so it's an experimental factor, and so the machine learning approach is supposed to do some corrections themselves. That's why we have the reference data, which is a term that I prefer to use for ground truth. That says, for example, I label one manuscript with 12th century and the place, and then if it's at another manuscript from the 14th century, and if the model says, oh yeah, that's the same, we can automatically say, no, it's not, redo the process. So there are some automatized methods in doing it. But it's also what it's called like babysitting the learning process. So you also, because you have to try to correct the models and to push it in the right direction, to look at the right things, like not the background of the parchment color, but the script. So there is a lot of correction, and there's also humans need to do it. I mean, but it's a lot of trial and error and hoping, and a lot of meltdowns and involved. So that's at least in my project and from my experience, and I think it's probably the same everywhere also, because you always have to wait for a learning epoch or some to be done, and then you can revise, and then in the meantime new bugs appear, and it's yeah.
I mean, from my point of view, it comes a bit back to this epistemological question. So what I'm trying to do is I try to come up with models for text recognition that are capable of recognizing basically script families, not one specific scribe. And what you require for that is a massive amount of training data. So basically what you need ideally would be 100,000 pages that have been transcribed, but they should also be transcribed uniformly. So adhering to the same transcription rules. And if we're only thinking about a smaller model that still should be able to read something Latin scripts, let's say 14th, 15th century, this will require about 20,000 pages. And it's impossible from the start to think about the data set that is large enough and produced by so many people that it's still coherent, relying on the same transcription transliteration rules. So in that sense, we are feeding at the moment for these general models basically everything that we can get our hands on. And you see that in the resulting models. So you see that in certain cases it diverging towards certain characters you would not expect to see there, but you can then explain it based on the training data, where you have to go back and look at this data and see, okay, in that case, this is a character or a glyph appearing in this certain spot, and it's being resolved in that sense. And the same discussion, and that's the huge discussion amongst paleographers, is how to, if you're doing digital paleography, how to deal with abbreviation. Of course, you can teach a neural network to expand silently all the abbreviations, but in a sense, you're teaching then the system, besides the recognition, the computer vision recognition of the character, you also teach some kind of Latin or whatever language you're training it, and the system then tries to adhere a bit to that. So I think it reflects it urges us to reflect different layers we are working on. And in the old days, let's call it like that, we used to transcribe, and at the same time we used to do some of the interpretation. We knew this is an abbreviation, I can expand it, and maybe I can do a normalization on certain spellings because this is what would be expected. But these are all different layers that we're just doing in the same step. And if we're doing it computationally in a sound way, this is my opinion, and I know that people go in other directions there, but then we should think about these layers and say, okay, this is only the step where I try to do the transcription, but then I need to model the abbreviation signs, for example. That could be a sound, from my point of view, a sound approach to deal with that. But of course, in the end, it would be nice to have a text with expanded abbreviation. So let's do that automatically. This is the the other direction you can come from. And the human there is basically the decisive factor, and also the amount of data is the second decisive factor there, because you will need huge amounts of data to train that in a general manner.
For that, we still got a question from Suzette.
Yes. Kind of in the same vein, maybe also playing advocate of the devil. Alberto, you a while back now in this discussion, you were talking about the digital object as something that you can layer with information, so you can add information if something new pops open when you're doing your research. But so if we are using these digital objects as tools for study, or we're using deep learning on specific data, and we get some information out of that and put it back into the digital object and then study more, I'm wondering if you could reflect on this idea of the way we are creating knowledge in this way, where there becomes this iterative feedback loop, where how can we think about this kind of possible skewing of information because we're using these models or these tools and layering information on top of each other?
I think that this is where our being humanist comes back in, because this is what we've been always doing. Like we gather information ourselves in different ways, and then we rework on the data we have, and we try to find the answer to what we were asking. So the data needs to start from a question: what do we want to find out? And then, by the way in which we work with the data, we might skew ourselves, and that's something that I've done before. It's always something that we need to keep in mind. But I think that when we get to the digital, this doesn't change. And our training as a humanist, I think it's where we are really, we're really trained to think in this manner and to try to stay objective when there's no real objectivity and the data is very dirty and limited in a way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. We get approximately 5 minutes left for our originally foreseen 90 minutes. So if you allow me, I'd like to come back once again to the dark side of things. Because I was really wondering when I saw your presentation, which was probably, Lisa, which was probably the most optimistic, actually, and the most positive from the 4 videos we had for that session, in a certain way, perhaps including Alberto's also, was very enthusiastic about the possibilities of VSCO. I was wondering whether this work in which you produce an entirely virtual object, that in the resequencing you're doing, I really like the expression, kind of recombines existing information that relies, transformed in the digital medium, on concretely existing material, but constitutes something totally new and only existing in the virtual space, whether there might be specific dangers for the further work that's been done with that object. Now it's existing and can be visited and looked at in the virtual space. Are there any specific problems that you might imagine for them developing further analyses on the basis of this virtually constructed artifact?
Absolutely. I mean, the interoperability and open access come with that danger by definition, right? If you are going to commit to open access digital models, if you're going to commit to the interoperability, for example, of working with structured metadata or IIIF, that's the price you pay. That's the risk you take. So my resequences are hosted on Fragmentarium platform, which is open access completely. Those resequences now have their own JSON. They have their own IIIF manifest that can itself be mirrored into someone else's project, right? So you do have these kind of layers of use and reuse. And I think that's the rule of the game, right? If you want to be part of an open access, interoperable, linked open data community, you just accept that risk that you are putting something out there. It's open access. It's got a CC BY license. It can be used and reused and remixed, and people can do what they want with it, with the understanding that they're citing your work. And I can give as an example, right now at this moment, Christie's auction house has 2 Beauvais missile leaves for sale in 2 different sales that came from 2 different sources. And in one of them, they cite my reconstruction. They give the URL, they give the manifest and everything, which is great. In the other one, they're clearly quoting me, but without citing me or my work, even though they're both being done by, they were done by 2 different people, but both at the same auction house. And so there is an expectation that everyone is going to play by the same rules in this community, that you're going to cite the work, that you're going to, if you reuse something, you're going to explain where it comes from. That's even, if you post an image on Twitter, right? X, Blue Sky, Mastodon, wherever we are these days, there's an understanding and an expectation for best practices that you're going to give the shelf mark or a URL, right? And those are the rules that we all are committing to play by if we're going to be part of this community.
Yeah, and I will add that we, on top of being honest about what we use, so if we start from the digital to started that we started with the digital and not the original manuscript, we also need to be honest about how we think our data is precise and concrete, because you can input errors there that you are aware that you are unsure about something, but once you put it into the digital, seems like it's either yes or no. And that's why with the VSCOL, I was really pushing, and we did it in the end. So we added an uncertainty element to all the things you describe in VSCOL. You can say, I'm pretty certain this is correct. I don't know. So, flags. There might be some mistakes here, or I really don't know. I'm just wild guessing here. So being really honest about what you use and how you got there, or where you're unsure, I think is very important with the data.
And you also have to be really honest and transparent about if you've manipulated an image, how that image has been manipulated. This is, something that has come up in the last year or so online, in particular with fragmentology work, where there are examples of people digitally inserting a resequenced manuscript into a binding without explaining, I'm just doing this because I think it's pretty and I'd like to put the manuscript in binding. I am not trying to tell you that this manuscript is in fact in that binding. And that's a real problem, because once you've got something out in the world, if you're not being transparent about that information is just going to get lost as it moves through sharing and resharing. And eventually people will assume that it's the truth when it's actually manipulated. And that's a problem that everyone faces online, is with deep fakes and manipulated images. So that's a really important best practice, is to always explain if you've manipulated an image, how you've done it.
But if we wanted to finish on a positive note, sorry if I may, this could also be a huge argument for working in the digital, because of course it's much easier to manipulate and copy and stuff, but at the same time it's quite easy to prove that something was there in the digital realm. So it's really hard to then claim, but I didn't know or didn't see that, because you can prove, okay, this has been online at this specific point of time, especially if you're thinking about Git systems that help you with versioning, for example, where it just can say, okay, here there's the check-in date, basically. So if someone then is working on that and is using the exact same data, you can rely on that it has probably been the data where it has been taken from. So I think that the problem is not, or is of course partially that people can come and copy our stuff, but at the same time it's quite easy to prove, no, this has been my idea or this was my work at a specific point in time. Whereas if you're working on a manuscript for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, it's really hard if someone is publishing something in similar time frame that who came up with the thing first.
Excellent. So at the end, we managed to refer to Receptio Gate without saying the name.
Who said it? Not me.
I've never said that. So all that's left to do with me now, we reached the end of the time that is allotted to us. I would have a large number of additional questions, but for the moment, I will mainly say thank you to all 4 of you and also the members of the public and their questions. So thank you very much. For this really passionate 90 minutes, and we are off to a break. We'll reconvene in half an hour at 4 p.m. local time. You're obviously welcome to continue following us, but thank you very much again, first and foremost.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. What a great discussion. Thank you all so much. I probably will not be able to join you for the rest of the day, but it's really been just a magnificent discussion. Thank you all so much. Take care.
Thank you, Lisa.